Chapter 14 Ancient Chinese Philosophy 1. Now that we have concluded with the materialist theory of history, I want to present a brief survey of ancient Chinese philosophy, the Chinese philosophy of the classical period. Of course, I cannot launch into a detailed discussion. I can only outline the most important points of view. I approach this topic from the standpoint of our general theme, therefore, with the question: in what relation does Chinese philosophy stand to the modern worldview, to dialectical materialism? Can some of its ingredients be imported into dialectical materialism? Can we, through recasting, through reforming, bring it into line with dialectical materialism, or is it necessary to make a radical break with it? To find the answer, we will consider the following question in detail. 1. In what relation does ancient Chinese philosophy stand to religion? 2. Under what economic and social conditions did this ancient philosophy flower? What was its historical role, and what historical role can it play today? And 3. What is the place of ancient Chinese philosophy in history generally? What fundamental tendencies of philosophy are represented in it, and what permanent contributions has it made? The first question I want to detail with its relation of ancient Chinese philosophy to religion. In this regard, there is a fundamental difference between Chinese philosophy on the one hand and Greek and part of Indian philosophy on the other. In Greece, and to a certain extent in India, philosophy marked the beginning of a criticism of popular religion, the beginning of the search for a natural materialistic explanation of the world. This was especially true in Greece. But we have also seen that a materialistic school of philosophy developed in India. With the exception Yangtze, the theoretical and practical materialist, who has, however, an isolated phenomenon and established no school, Chinese classical philosophy left the popular and state religion untouched. Confucius dealt with the popular and state religion chiefly as a means of regulating political and social life. He fixed the conditions of traditional religious rituals and ceremonies, those of ancestor worship, as well as those associated with the worship of the nature gods. As for Lao Tse, philosophic speculation was linked with the tradition of soothsaying and with the germs of philosophy or philosophical lore, to which it gave rise, germs such as were contained in Ye King. Accordingly, one must guard against reading things into the earliest ideas of Chinese popular and state religion, which were not originally there. Christian mercenaries and synologists sought and found monotheism, the belief in a single God. They considered Shang-Tai, the Lord of Heaven, to be the single God. The wish to find Christian ideas, or at least footholds for Christian ideas in Chinese popular religion, was here father to the thought. Actually, this Shang-Tai was no more the sole and exclusive God than Zeus was among the Greeks, or Jupiter among the Romans. In ancient Chinese religion, Shang-Tai was never more than the highest God. He was not the only God. In this very early period, this highest God was thought of as a person. Traces of this are still found in the Yang King, the earliest collection of Chinese songs. The songs of Yang King come from a period corresponding to the period of the epic poems of the Greeks, the Iliad and Odyssey. The oldest religious ideas of the Chinese belong to the most primitive that we know, worship of the spirits of the ancestors, or animism. With this earliest stage, with the belief in the spirits of the deceased ancestors, which is the first religious stage of all peoples, is linked to a later stage, the culture of nature spirits, spirits of the mountains, of the earth, of heaven, of rivers, etc. The worship of these spirits and the ideas held about them are adapted to the needs of a primitive agricultural people. It is also characteristic that the worship of these powers of nature was restricted to the ruling feudal nobility and officialdom. All this means that the ideas of nature spirits and their worship were the product of a much higher stage of development. The fact that the worship of ancestral spirits, the earliest and most primitive stage of Chinese popular religion, was the starting point of Chinese philosophy is, of course, significant for its development. The more so since it did not critically oppose popular and state religion, as did ancient Greek natural philosophy and Indian materialism. I want to stress this. Even discounting these very definite facts which contradict the idea that monotheism prevailed in ancient China, all historical experience would still oppose the notion that monotheism came first in the religious development of a people, and that belief in ancestors and nature spirits did not develop until later. Yet this notion is upheld by a new ethnographic school in Europe led by Father W. Schmidt and allied with the Vatican and Catholic missionary activity. Basically, we have here simply an old missionary yarn poorly concealed in the cloak of science. I now turn to the question of why there was this uncritical relation between ancient philosophy and the popular and state religion in China. Why is there no evidence of conflict with religion? The first and basic reason I find in the fact that in ancient China, no special priestly caste or class was established. Priestly functions in ancient China were, as you know, joined with those of the father of the family, the elders of the tribe, the feudal lords, and the feudal monarchs and officials. Together with political functions, they practiced priestly duties. Priestly function in ancient China were an appendage of family and tribal government and of political power. This, in one respect, is plainly connected with the fact that in ancient China, the state and the state authority developed from the functions of management and control of irrigation, of canal building, etc. The second reason, in ancient China, in contrast with Greece, we have a very weak and insignificant development of commodity production, and accordingly of manufacture and of industry as well, i.e. of factors which impel a natural explanation of the world. The economy of classical China was very predominantly a nature economy. Agriculture on a primitive communistic base with a feudal superstructure. Ancestor worship and the worship of nature spirits in this period corresponded completely with economic and social relations. Ancestor worship secured and consecrated the social bonds within the broad kinship of families and tribes. The worship of nature spirits provided the spiritual means of unifying the feudal state, which transcended the tribal organizations. It also provided the means of binding these tribal organizations to the state. Ancestor worship and worship of nature spirits corresponded perfectly with the economic and class structure of ancient Chinese society. It molded itself to the structure in the closest possible fashion. Thus is explained, I believe, the peculiar behavior of Chinese philosophy towards the popular and state religion. It is a fact that this behavior was not one of conflict. I now turn to the second question, namely the question of the social and political role of ancient Chinese philosophy and its various tendencies. I shall try to sketch in a few strokes a general picture of the period in which ancient Chinese philosophy bloomed. First, a few dates. In round numbers, it is the period of the 5th and 4th centuries before Christ, a time incidentally of great religious and philosophical crisis both in India and Greece. Confucius appeared in the 6th century BC. He was born in 551 and died in 478. Lao Tze's birth is now set in 604. As for the technical aspect of this period, it is very important to keep in mind that it marked the boundary line between the Bronze Age and the Iron Age, between the period when bronze was the chief material for making tools and the period when iron was chiefly used. The Bronze Age in China stretched from 2000 to 5000 BC, the Iron Age from 500 on. Iron was first used only for utensils and tools for women, such as needles, and not until later for weapons. This was evidently because not until later was it learned how to temper iron so that it could be used for making weapons as well. These centuries were extremely turbulent. It was the crisis of feudalism, the period of the overthrow of the central feudal power, of violent conflict among feudal states for supremacy. It was a period in which the border states, through great struggles, conquered new territories from the neighboring barbarian hordes. The struggles with the border peoples, which were undertaken by the border states, developed the military power of these states. It was therefore no accident that it was precisely the state of Sin, which had long waged such wars, that were later able to establish the centralized absolute monarchy. As far as the feudal classes were concerned, the period of feudal wars was a time of the greatest uncertainty in all vital relationships, a time of violent turns of fate. Many feudal groups succumbed in war. Their fate hung continually in the balance. One day a feudal lord would be in power, the next banished or dead. For the great masses of the people, these centuries were a period of increasing oppression, increasing exploitation. Oppressive compulsory labor was imposed upon them. To this was added the burden of military service. To compulsory labor were added taxes, in kind chiefly from the harvest yield. We also have the introduction of a salt and iron impost as early as the 7th century. The salt and iron impost was the invention of one of the older philosophers, Kant. A clear description of the military service which the peasants had to perform may be found in the songs of Yan Qing. There are songs in which the peasants bewail the fact that they have been separated from their families for years, that they must perform military service against the barbarians, etc. The feudal lord of this period rode to war on a war chariot, like the ancient Homeric heroes, each chariot having an escort of foot soldiers. These foot soldiers were peasants. The feudal wars were, of course, waged to the neglect of the most important of all government functions in China, the maintenance of irrigation works, of canals, dams, and irrigation ditches. Irrigation in ancient China was the vital problem for the great masses of the people. If we wish to group the class struggles of this period, we find two main groups. First, the struggle among feudal lords, struggles for supremacy. Second, the struggle between the feudal lords and the peasants, struggles over compulsory labor and taxes. Finally, we have the middle class of ancient China, the literati. The literati play a role intermediate between the two main classes, the feudal lords and the peasant masses. This middle position between the feudal lord and the peasantry determines their ideological role. Laozi, as the earliest, will be considered first. The nucleus of his philosophy in its social and political aspect is the concept of wei, of inaction. This concept of inaction, of letting things go their own way with the least possible interference, is equivalent to the concept that the state should interfere as little as possible in the affairs of the peasant masses, in the self-government of the tribal villages. Laozi says that the government is best of which the people are least aware. He is against urban and courtly culture. He is for a simple, primitive life and against knowledge and erudition, which under the existing conditions was impossible without the exploitation of the people. In contrast to Confucius, he is against tradition and very characteristically against the use of force. Things ought to develop of themselves, he felt. It is not an accident that Laozi came from the half-barbaric border state of Shu. This was one of those those half-barbaric southern states which bred a mixture of Chinese and non-Chinese peoples. Lao Tzu is made most clear when compared with a modern thinker, Leo Tolstoy, whose doctrines resemble this in its essential features. The doctrine of Tolstoy, as you know, likewise opposes the use of force. It is inspired by hate and enmity against the state and the great feudal landlord. Leo Tolstoy was a penitent nobleman, himself a landowner. He sided with the peasantry against the landowners. As Lenin has shown, Leo Tolstoy reflects the peasants' resistance against feudalism and against the feudal state. The village, according to Tolstoy, should govern itself. The state should not interfere. Tolstoy's resistance, however, reflects the peasants' resistance against feudalism and against the feudal state. The village, according to Tolstoy, should govern itself. The state should not interfere. He left. Tolstoy's resistance, however, was of the passive sort. He rejected conflict, the use of force. This is consistent with the fact that at this time the peasant revolution was not yet joined with the revolution of the urban proletariat, and that Tolstoy himself had no understanding of the proletarian revolution. But the position of the peasant class is such that it alone can never combat the centralized power of the state, because rustic life is not congenial to close-knit organization. The peasantry, although it comprises many millions, is split into countless small units. Here one peasant family, there another, here one village, there another, without organized lines. Hence, the peasant class can accomplish a revolution in only two ways, either by joining another class in which supplies the organizational leadership, the bourgeoisie, as the French bourgeois revolution, or the class, as in Russia, or by attaining their revolutionary objective through a centralized monarchy, or through a dictator such as Napoleon III in France, or Shi Huangti in ancient China. Through comparison with Tolstoy and historical role of Lao Tzu, will become apparent. Land Tzu embodies the passive protest, the passive resistance of the peasants' village against the feudal state and the feudal landlords. The state should keep its hands off the village. The village should govern itself and supervise its own farming. This attitude of Lao Tzu does not correspond to a revolutionary position. It corresponds to a position of passive resistance, of non-cooperation, withdrawal or separation from the state. The conception of Lao Tzu has been called anarchism. Well, anarchism is also Tolstoy's political position, but the word anarchism signifies little. It can have various sources. It can arise from the conditions of the peasantry at a certain stage of development, the conditions in Russia at the time of Tolstoy and in China at the time of Lao Tzu, or even from a certain condition of the working class as in present-day Italy and France. Thus, the mere word anarchism does not make one understand the theory of Lao Tzu. One must comprehend the totality of class relations at the time and the condition of the peasant class in particular, in order to understand Lao Tzu's peculiar road. Before I turn to Confucius, I will interpret one more general idea common to both Lao Tzu and Confucius, an idea which harkens back to much earlier conceptions, the idea of the unity of the natural and social orders. This idea is contained in Ye King, for example. It is called Lung Fan, the supreme rule, and runs: through differential conduct, rain will come at the proper time. If one knows how to speak appropriately, the sky will clear. If one's management is judicious, it will be warm in good time. If one attends to prudent advice, lo, at the right time it will grow cold. But if the ruler can call upon a holy one, then favorable winds will blow. European sinologists have called this idea universalism, the doctrine of the universal unity of natural and social orders. They find it very odd, but as soon as one considers the social relationships from which it arose, its meanings becomes clear. In countries where irrigation is crucial to the entire economy, where irrigation is the most important activity of state government, where the yield of harvest and the existence of the people depend on it. This idea is quite natural. This unity is urgent and fundamental that in countries where the culture has been conditioned by irrigation, a collapse of the ruling power has been accomplished by a collapse of the irrigation system. In areas which once supported a dense population have fallen into complete disuse and have been transformed into wasteland. I think of Spain, where the Arabian rulers built canals, which were allowed to go under their Christian successors. The most striking example is Mesopotamia between the Euphrates and the Tigris, a country which in antiquity was one of the most fertile producers of grain, but which today, after the deterioration of its system of irrigation, is a bare and dry desert. In a land like China, with its huge irrigation system, the close connection between the functions of the state government and the thriving of agriculture, the close connection between the social and natural orders is clear and self-evident to every peasant. Here the state government is for peasant economy, a natural force of the first order which determines the operation of other natural forces, important to the peasant and which is crucial to his economic existence. I now come to Confucius. In contrast to Lao Tzu, Confucius came from an old noble family of the north, from the province of Shantung. His historical role is quite different from that of Lao Tzu. His goal was a profound far-reaching reform and thereby a re-establishment of the traditional feudal order. For this purpose, Confucius projected an ideal picture of feudalism. He placed this ideal picture in antiquity. In the last analysis, this picture of the earliest emperors projected by Confucius and his disciples is merely an historical poem, not true history. A poem in which they presented their conception of the perfect feudal order. Their political and social goal was to free the feudal order of its excrescences. It is a conception according to which the government official should be the intermediary between the feudal lord and the people. An intermediary, however, charged with the interests of the feudal lord. A fundamental concept in Confucius is that the people cannot govern themselves, but they must be governed by wise and judicious officials. The people are inevitably political minors. His great ambition was to reconcile the people to the reformed feudal order. And to this end, he created a whole structure of ceremonies to consolidate the foundations of this order. As a pillar of the feudal order, Confucius set forth a vindication of patriarchal authority, the authority of the husband over the wife and children, the domination of the elder brother over the young brother, the doctrine of filial affection. Quite justly, he says that sovereignty in the state is built upon the authority of the father in the home. Under the social conditions of the time, the regulation and consolidation of paternal authority meant the consolidation of the whole structure of the feudal order. The deep and lasting influence of Confucius is explained by the fact that the patriarchal family is the cell, the substructure of feudalism. At the end of the Zhao dynasty, the shaken superstructure of feudalism was overthrown, and for the time being the doctrine of Confucius was shaken. But since the patriarchal family remained the undisturbed basis of the life of the Chinese people, even after the fall of feudalism, the basis upon which successive superstructures were raised, the doctrine of Confucius was able to recover and continue up to the most recent times as the dominant Chinese worldview. Chapter 15. Ancient Chinese Philosophy 2. Now that we have discussed Confucius and Lao Tzu, I will return to Moti. Moti lived after Confucius and Lao Tzu, probably from 500 to 420 BC. The instability of the period, the collapse of feudalism, and the increasing oppression of the people provided the impetus for his philosophy. Also, to the main currents in Chinese philosophy represented by Lao Tzu and Confucius, Moti added a third. For Lao Tzu, the fundamental concept is, as I have already explained, wei, or inaction, passive resistance against the encroachments of the feudal authority of the state, self-government of the tribal village. Confucius is the reformer within the bounds of feudal relationships. In contrast to Confucius, Moti is a revolutionary. He may be described as a utopian agrarian socialist or agrarian communist. He preached to the return to agrarian communism. As a means of achieving this end, he urged mutual love, universal human love. He was utopian socialist or communist because he did not expect salvation to come through a revolution from below, but through the discernment of the ruling class, through wise lawgivers. With these ideas, Motu obtained a powerful contemporary following among the people. Wang Tze, a disciple of Confucius and contemporary of Mao Ti, says, Mao Ti and Yang Ji are the two who have the ear of the people. They are the two to whom the people listen. Moti is the only one who can be called a revolutionary in the sense mentioned. Not, of course, a revolutionary in the modern sense. He led a passionate denunciation of the feudal class. He fought against the luxury and dissipation of the feudal lords, against the music, which at that time was a courtly luxury. He opposed the ceremonies of mourning, which imposed great expense upon individuals and kept them away from work for long periods of time. His disciples led an ascetic life. They formed a sort of religious community. The fourth main current is represented by the Sophists, or as they are called, the Dialecticians, the Menkyu. They stress the subjective nature of knowledge. Stimulated by Moti, they introduced the first investigation of mental processes. Their historical role is quite obvious. Historically viewed, they were agents who hastened the disintegration of feudalism and prepared the way for the monarchy of Shi Ti. In this regard, Sun Tzu was of particular importance. The connection was indeed very close and would even have been openly avowed. If ideas are subjective or conventional, he claimed, then it becomes the concern of the monarch to establish the right ideas. The overthrow of feudalism by Shang Ti, 246 to 210 BC, was ideologically prepared and justified by the Sophists or Dialecticians. In this connection, I have something further to say about Yang Ji, the contemporary of Moti. I have already mentioned that Moti and Yang Ji had the largest numbers of followers among the people. Not a single letter of Yang Ji's own writing is preserved. He is known only through citations in Mingzi. Confucianist orthodoxy took the trouble to suppress the doctrine of Yang Ji. According to the merger accounts which we have from his opponents, he was a materialist and a Epicurean. He preached individualism and egoism. In him can he seen the expression of commodity production rearing its head within feudalism, as well as the expression of commercial and finance capital. I'll now turn to the third point of view from which we may consider Chinese philosophy. The first point of view was its relation to religion. The second its relation to class relationships of the time. The third point of view considers its relation to style, the fundamental strengths of philosophy. First, I will very briefly consider Confucius. Characteristic of Confucius is the demand for the reification of names. By names, he means concepts, concepts. Social relationships, moral conduct should conform to previously instilled ideas or names. Confucius says, quote, if names are not right, just judgments will not be appropriate. And if judgments are not right actions will not fulfill their purpose. End quote. Reality, especially social reality, ought to be determined by the idea of material life by the ideal life. To Confucius, therefore, we can justly attribute a fundamental idealistic philosophic trend. This is supported further by his attitude towards proper and official religion, which was certainly not critical and hostile. Lao Tzu also belongs to the idealistic trend. He can be designated as an objective or absolutist idealist. The highest principle which he propounded, Tao, is a transcendental spiritual principle. As you know, the name is taken from a word which originally meant way or direction or the right way. In modern physics, the technical term vector is used in the sense of a directed magnitude. Originally, the way, of course, of the constellations was designated by Tao. Later, it was applied to earthly things. Its meaning is transcendental or spiritual world order. Like other peoples, the Chinese first derived the concept of lawfulness from the movements of the constellations. In Lao Tzu, we have further deeper penetration than in Confucius, but he was handicapped by the difficulties inherent in a language which expresses abstract ideas with words having perceptive reference. This explains his extraordinary obscurity, and obscurity signifying not only the depth of his thought, but the inadequacy of his means of expression as well. I will give a few examples of how he tries to express the non-materiality of or spirituality of Tao in perspective language. At one place he says, quote, Mind, activity, things, invisible, inconceivable, indivisible, are the images therein. End quote. Or another very simple figure in the 14th chapter, quote, Beating it, one does not see its visage. Following it, one does not see its back. End quote. Of course, these figures are intended to express merely the simple idea that Tao is not to be apprehended through the senses. The comparison of Tao with water is very frequent. As water permeates all, so does Tao permeate the world. It is the cosmic principle. He undoubtedly had a definite notion that water was somewhat less corporeal than a solid, and was therefore more akin to the abstract, the transcendental. I will cite one more sentence from Tao Te King, where he says, quote, Without going beyond the door, one can explain the world. Without looking out of the window, one can explain the meaning of heaven. Here, end quote, here is indicated the possibility of knowledge without sensory experience, knowledge a priori, as Kant calls it. This is also a typically idealistic position. At another place he says, quote, In Tao there are images, there are the seeds of things. End quote. This is a doctrine that bears a most striking similarity to that of the Greek philosopher Plato, the doctrine of ideas or mental prototypes of material things. I will now speak of the elements or presentments of dialectics in Lao Tzu. These elements of dialectics we find in two persistent ideas. The first is the idea of the eternal variability or fluctuation of things, of the flux of all things. The second, expressed in various concrete examples, is what you already know as the first principle of dialectics, namely the permeation of opposites. But before I return to what Lao Tzu himself says, I might first mention that Lao Tzu is not the first in China to have such ideas. We have already found the elements of these concepts in the oldest books of China, in the philosophical ideas contained in the King. The symbol Yi means change, fluctuation, and consists of the sign placed opposite that of the moon. The Yi King is much older than Lao Tzu, and Confucius. It dates from 1143 BC. Its author or compiler is thought to be the King Wan, the founder of the Shao dynasty. The Yi King was originally believed to be a prophetic book. Men used to seek clues to determine which positions of the constellations were favorable for a proposed undertaking and which not. For this purpose, diagrams were drawn of single or broken lines. What interests us here is that these diagrams were based on the idea of the permeation of opposites, of the polarity of concepts. Examples of such polar concepts are yang and yin, heaven and earth, male and female, light and dark, strong and weak, father and mother, etc. These are only a few examples of the polar opposites which are listed in Yin King, and through whose development changes in heaven and on earth were to be explained. When one examines the symbol Yi King and its meanings more closely, one comes to the conclusion that they originated in the thoughts and conjectures of peasants about constellar positions favorable for agricultural undertakings. The main concepts are heaven, earth, mountains, water, etc. Similar notions are to be found among the ancient Greeks and Romans. Among the Greeks, for example, a work of the poet Hesiod is very reminiscent of the way good and bad days are determined in the King. Hesiod's book is called Works and Days. Its main purpose is to determine for the peasants which days are favorable and which unfavorable for certain agricultural tasks. The Romans too had similar techniques. The King very clearly became an oracle book for princes and statesmen. The link between the Yi King and Lao Tse was created by the philosopher Count Xi, 7th century. I've already told you that Count Xi was likewise a great businessman, having introduced the salt and iron monopoly. I will now cite a few examples from Lao Tse of the permeation of opposites. In the very first chapter of the Tao Te King, we have the following, quote, "When everyone on earth declares beauty beautiful, ugliness is thereby postulated. When everyone on earth recognizes the good in goodness, thereby evil is postulated. Being and non-being produce each other. Heavy and light complete each other. Long and short compose each other. High and low invert each other. Voice and tone with each other. Before and after follow each other." This idea in Lao Tse attains abstract expression because he states his position on the oppositive relation of being and non-being, even making the point that each is transformed into the other. He says that all things come from being, that being, however, comes from non-being. Things revert to non-being. This reminds one strikingly of what Hegel developed in the Dialectics of Origin. In the following sayings of Lao Tse, one can find elements analogues to the Hegelian thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, where he says, for example, quote, "Mind creates unity. Unity generates duality. Duality generates trinity. Trinity generates all things," end quote. The symbol of unity is the broken line, of duality, the broken line, negation, and the sign of trinity, the broken and straight line, placed one under the other. Another very profound conception of Lao Tse, which remains one of Hegel, is that the impulse in things comes from non-being. In Hegel's view, the moving force of things is ascribed to negation. For this, Lao Tse uses various metaphorical expressions, as when he says that the usefulness of the jar depends upon non-being, upon empty space, or when he says that the wagon hub is useful only by virtue of its hollowness. If we designate Confucius and Lao Tse as idealists, then we can find in Mo Ti, the third main current of Chinese philosophy, a straightforward, even though primitive and underdeveloped, materialism. Besides this, Mo Ti performed another service. He initiated the independent development of logic in China. In order to indicate the type and nature of his materialism, I cite the following statement by him concerning the characteristics of truth. He says in chapter 29, quote, My view of being and non-being rests on what the actual experience of the eyes or ears of the people accept as existent or non-existent, that is, on what is seen and heard. Thus, that which is seen and heard I call being. That which has never been seen or heard I call non-being. End quote. In contrast to Confucius, therefore, he does not consider conception to be the characteristic of truth, but rather perceptual experience, that which is seen or heard. Moreover, he means general perceptual experience, not individual but universal, or, as he himself expressed it, quote, that which the entire people sees and hears, end quote. As further marks of truth, he includes the testimony of ancient sages and the actual operation of things. Yet how primitive his concept of materialism still was is proved by some of his conclusions. He says, quote, I acknowledge the spirits of ancestors as well as the spirits of nature, for the people acknowledge them, and acknowledge no destiny contrary to theirs, end quote. On the other hand, it was characteristic of his materialistic conception that he rejected Confucius' principle of the reification of concepts. He says, and this is not an objection in line with historical materialism, that it is not the ideas, the concepts of man that determine their behavior, but something that lies behind these ideas. He means the material causes, the impulsions of will. One cannot on this account call him a dialectical materialist, but he did have presentiments in this direction. In utterance ascribed to Cao Si, a student of Moti, points the same way. It is the sentence cited in Wang Zi, quote, whatever words cannot grasp is not in the interests of the spirit, and whatever the spirit cannot grasp is not in the interests of life, end quote. In other words, only that which has reference to the interests of life can be an object of knowledge, and only that which is within the sphere of knowledge can be a subject of speech, of verbal communication. Another saying by Moti runs, quote, only when one makes use of conformities and distinctions at the same time is one in position to know what is and what is not. In conclusion, I will mention the fourth main current, the Sophists. They can be classed with the subjective idealists. The Sophists were especially adept at pointing out contradictions in concepts, just as the Greek Sophists were. In this pursuit, they fell upon all sorts of interesting phenomena in the dialectics of ideas and turned up many things quite similar to the findings of the Greeks, especially the Dialectics. There is the instance of the arrow at rest. It was said that an arrow in flight could, at any given moment, be considered at rest. This is a statement which we have already found among the Greeks. Another statement of a different sort runs as follows in the Chinese. Quote, when I break a staff into two parts, and each of these parts into two parts, and so on, I will never reach an ending of breaking. End quote. Here we have the contradiction between the finite and the infinite. One example of the great contributions of the Sophists is their discovery of the contradiction hidden in every statement. The contradiction, for example, that a white horse is not a horse. The sense of the matter is that a white horse is a particular horse. The predicate horse is the general horse. In the sentence, the particular and the general are equated. Most of these Sophists were, as I have said, subjective idealists. Some, however, were materialists. Characteristic of their type of subjective idealism are such savings as, quote, fire is not hot, the eye does not see, quote, that is to say, the nature of temperature, end quote, that is to say, the nature of temperature and vision is not objective but subjective. I will now conclude. Can the modern worldview, by which I mean dialectical materialism, be squared with this ancient philosophy? Today, adherents to the doctrines of Confucius and Lao Tzu would be positively reactionary. The support of the doctrine of Confucius has today a counter-revolutionary, reactionary significance. It would mean the defense of patriarchal authority in the state. Likewise, one cannot adhere to Lao Tzu, for we cannot brook a doctrine which today would have to appear as a form of anarchism. The doctrine of Laozi, if revived, would at best result in a passive tolerance of the reactionary forces in the state, in society, or it would result in individual escape from the world. But the revolution now in process in China demands not individual but collective behavior from the masses of the people, not passivity and contemplation, but the greatest activity. I wish, moreover, to mention that China offers practical proof how anarchism at a certain point is transformed into counter-revolution, in the same way as has already been demonstrated in Russia. We can no more adhere to Laozi than to Confucius because both are idealistic, because both stand in opposition to materialism. No more can we hold to the subjective idealism of the sophists. Mao Tse comes closest to dialectical materialism. His doctrine is a primitive materialism, and Mao Tse assumes a revolutionary position towards the ruling classes of his time. Nevertheless, one cannot recommend reviving Mao Tse's doctrine as such. It is socially impossible today to return to the primitive communism of the village community. It is possible only to advance to socialism on the basis of the achievements of capitalist technology. Obviously, Mao Tse could not have had such a perspective, living as he did at a time which had no inkling of capitalism. Dialectical materialism is on a much higher level than the primitive materialism of Mao Tse. It has incorporated and developed the results of 2,000 years of natural and social science. We cannot turn back. Our prospect must be ahead. Chapter 16, Pragmatism. I would like to continue with a survey of the main currents in the contemporary bourgeois philosophy of Europe and America, but through limitations of space I must confine myself to a brief characterization of one of these trends, namely pragmatism. It is the dominant school in America and has always had a powerful influence in England and to a lesser degree in other European countries. I select this particular school because it is the best known of the foreign worldviews or philosophies and because it has a particularly progressive, democratic, and unprejudiced quality. It is therefore not so easy for the uninitiated to recognize that the true character of this philosophy is reactionary and idealistic. The bourgeois philosophy of Europe, which followed classical philosophy, in Germany this would mean philosophy subsequent to Feuerbach, still maintains an extensive superficial existence. There is an immense amount of philosophical literature in Germany and in other countries. Every university has one or more professors of philosophy, but Feuerbach marks the beginning of the end of bourgeois philosophy and of philosophy in general in the historical sense of the word. What has appeared since then as bourgeois philosophy of one kind or another must be termed philosophical poems supported by concepts. These have been more or less interesting historically, but they evince no scientific progress. In fact, it will be discovered that all the various schools and sects of bourgeois philosophy after Feuerbach revolve about just one problem, namely how bourgeois society and the capitalist order can best be defended against the socialist revolution, how in some universal and fundamental way it can be vindicated and supported, how the most powerful ideological enemy of the existing order, dialectical materialism, can be most successfully staved off. Besides fending off its enemy, dialectical materialism, the bourgeoisie must strengthen its belief in its own order. These are actually the problems about which the various schools of modern bourgeois philosophy revolve. They cope with it through deception and by the demand for quote-unquote unprejudiced science. As a rule, the proprietors of this kind of philosophy are completely unconscious of its objective. The capitalist order and everything that belongs to it is the unexpressed and usually unconscious assumption and purpose behind research. It is the natural matrix. This doesn't help the situation, however. It only makes it more dangerous. To be sure, there are still many individual accomplishments of a scientific nature, even in bourgeois philosophy. In this category belongs the accumulation of material on the history of philosophy, the elaboration of certain problems in logic, the mathematical development of logic, etc. But these are only the last buds of a dying stalk. Bourgeois philosophy in its various schools represents just such a dying stalk. One must not be deceived by its extensive superficial existence. The philosophy of the Middle Ages, the scholastic, likewise, had a wide influence and possessed schools, teachers, and literature galore. It too made certain positive contributions. As a whole, however, it was fruitless. It was tied down, the handmaiden of the Church, the defender of the Church's established dogmas. Modern bourgeois philosophy is no less closely bound to capitalism than this scholasticism was bound to the Church and its dogmas. But what was open and understood in scholasticism is carefully concealed and hidden by our modern scholasticism. Now, a few more comments on the general nature of post-war philosophy. Naturally, I refer to both Europe and America. The war, and related to it, the beginning of the World Revolution, very profoundly disturbed bourgeois society. We therefore have a universal quest for spiritual supports for bourgeois society, stronger and more potent supports than those offered by earlier philosophy. We have a revival of the various forms of metaphysics. The way was already prepared for this before the war, but after the war it received a much sharper impetus. We have the creation of a transcendental world of fantasy, a much greater concentration upon religious ideas, which is in part a regression to the crudest superstition, to spiritualism, for example. There is also an intrusion of such transcendental concepts and ideas into the natural sciences, especially those natural sciences which deal with the phenomena of life. There is the doctrine of vitalism, for example, the doctrine of life force. From the point of view of the proletarian revolution, or a national revolution, one can hardly regret that the bourgeoisie of the principal countries abandoned themselves in the name of the philosophy to the crudest superstition, to the most absurd religious fantasies, and to the greatest spiritual confusion. It is not our misfortune if the modern capitalistic bourgeoisie snatch up the ideas of the Australian jungle. Only we must see to it that these ideas are not carried over to the masses of people. We must help the working masses free themselves from the various forms of bourgeois as well as pre-bourgeois worldviews, from both crude and refined forms of religious fantasy. In this connection, a question might be raised. How does it happen that there are still so many schools of philosophy in modern times when the same problem, the same impulse underlies them all? To this, I believe the answer must be, first, the various historical stages of bourgeois society as a whole are involved. Then there are the differences in class relations between countries. Take England, Germany, America. The class relations of these countries have their local peculiarities. In the third place, in every country and at any given point in time, we must take into consideration the various groupings of the great and petty bourgeoisie, groupings which find expression in this or that philosophical conception. And finally, the ideological traditions of particular countries and the personal whims of philosophizing individuals play an appreciable, if not decisive, role. But in spite of great temporal, and local differences between particular schools, the universal counter-revolutionary and reactionary class character of the modern American and European bourgeoisie expresses itself in a host of characteristics which are common to all schools of bourgeois philosophy. Foremost is their aversion and opposition to materialism, especially dialectical materialism, and hence their fundamentally idealistic point of view, sometimes clear, sometimes obscure, but always present. Another common and extremely characteristic feature is the effort to restrict the scope and significance of reason and to extend the province of free will, anarchy, and the unconscious, the province of irrationality. Since the light of reason reveals to the bourgeoisie only the road to destruction, they prefer to shut or half shut their eyes and give themselves up to more pleasant fantasies. For fantasies they truly are when viewed with the clear eye of reason. I now come to the school of pragmatism. This school or trend originated in America. It then spread to England and Italy and, in lesser degree, to France and Germany. It reflects the characteristic spirit of the American bourgeoisie, hence the democratic and pseudo-radical touch, as well as the distortion of cause and effect, and the tendency towards commerce. Pragmatism is literally the philosophy of commerce. The first impulse towards this philosophy came from the American philosopher Peirce. In 1868, he wrote a short paper which can be looked upon as the germ of pragmatism. But the well-known American psychologist William James must be looked upon as the founder and leader of this school. For a long period, William James was a professor at Harvard University. His father had been a theologian of a school which was partial to spiritualism, a Swedenborgian. William James first taught as a natural scientist. His philosophy is a cross between theological and natural scientific concepts and methods in which theology has become dominant over natural science. It was the French philosopher Renouvier who gave to James the decisive stimulus which led to the philosophy of pragmatism. In England, the chief exponent of pragmatism was a certain Schiller, who for many years had been professor at Oxford. In America, the best-known representative of the school is now John Dewey, formerly of Chicago and latterly of New York. In 1919, immediately after the war, he visited first Japan and then China, where he propagandized for his doctrines, engaging in a higher sort of missionary expedition in the interest of America and Americanism. We are now to investigate the relation of pragmatism to the fundamental trends of philosophy. Pragmatism as a philosophic trend is apparently very radical. Indeed, it is sometimes called radical empiricism or the radical theory of experience, and it claims to be superior to both idealism and materialism. But this is a false pretension. Upon closer examination, one sees that what the pragmatists call experience, what they consider to be the ultimate and the primary, is nothing but the idealists' ultimate, namely the mental. The pragmatists merely talk about it in terms of sensation and emotion, that is, in terms of the simplest, most primary physical functions, whereas other idealists take higher physical functions as their primary. They maintain that in sensation and emotion, the physical and the physical compose an inseparable unity, and that the corporeal cannot be found except in union with the mental. They accordingly deny the existence of an external world independent of human sensations, ideas, or feelings. They carry this marvelous jugglery to the point where they say the relation of the mental to the corporeal is only a sham problem, not a real one. Naturally, if the existence of a material world independent of human consciousness is reasoned away, there can no longer be a problem of the relationship of such a world to human thought. This utterly simple and staggering solution is merely a sleight of hand by which the problem itself is made to disappear. In its fundamental conception, pragmatism is therefore idealism. The battle which it wages against the idealism of other schools is actually only a sham battle. The true and sincere opponent of pragmatism, the openly avowed opponent, is materialism, and dialectical materialism in particular. The fundamental conception of pragmatism shows an extremely close affinity with the conception of Ernest Mach, the Austrian philosopher and naturalist, and with Avenarius, the so-called school of empirical criticism. that we have not done pragmatism an injustice by calling it idealistic. It's supported by the testimony of the Encyclopedia Britannica, the great dictionary of the Anglo-Saxon world, which says in the article on William James that he defends the idealistic position from the empirical point of view. And the French historian of pragmatism, F. Lorax, characterizes pragmatism as an empirical and experiential idealism. I should like to cite one more fundamental concept of pragmatism. This is the fundamental concept of a pluralistic universe. It assumes that the world consists of component worlds which have no connection with each other. I need not labor the point that this concept is a nonsensical self-contradiction. To be sure, it is not self-contradictory to postulate a world which is at the same time a unity and a plurality, but to affirm a world, a universe which is plurality without unity is plainly a meaningless contradiction. If one asks oneself how a school of philosophy can achieve such palpable nonsense, one does not have to seek far for the answer. The prototype of the world, which consists of parts having nothing to do with each other, is the world of the high priests of all schools. A world composed of the earthly vow of tears and the heavenly hereafter, which are utterly and absolutely separate and different from each other. The pluralistic universe is merely a new higher label for this ancient and insipid clerical nonsense. A further characteristic of pragmatism is its concept of truth. For pragmatism, there is no objective measure of truth, since it recognizes no reality external to the human mind. It can have no touchstone for truth. According to pragmatism, truth is what quote-unquote works, what is useful. The measure is thus subjective. The undefined subject who is the measure of truth is not man in general, but the bourgeois in particular, and his particular ends. The bourgeois mind, governed by bourgeois interests, is made the supreme judge of truth. That this is very convenient for the bourgeoisie certainly cannot be disputed. The purpose of all these maneuvers of pragmatism is quote-unquote scientific salvation and vindication of the old religious nonsense. William James himself wrote a sizable book on the will to believe and another on religion experience, in which he tries to prove that every form of belief, no matter how insane, contains some element of truth, as long as it gives man a certain amount of power and effectiveness. For William James, the Christian religion in which he was reared in is such an effective truth. For the African, it may be a wooden idol studded with nails. The whole trick lies in calling something experience. That used to be known as belief or fantasy. William James, for example, says that the visible world is a part of a more spiritual universe, from which it derives its meaning. A statement that immediately reminds one of belief in ghosts. What William James passes off as religious truth or experience is a conglomeration of the creeds of the 100 or more Christian and non-Christian sects existing in America. It is the laboratory in which the fantastic products of various religions and sects are standardized into a normal or average bourgeois faith. If some sect began to believe that the moon was green cheese, and if this belief gave them strength, then pragmatism would mix this ingredient into the general religious brew. So much for this American. I should now like to give you a sample of the English pragmatist Schiller. It may suffice to give you his own statement of the contents of certain sections and paragraphs of his book, Riddles of the Sphinx. Thus, one section is called, quote, Man and His Cause God, A. As the first cause, but only the phenomenal world, C. As personal, D. As finite, because only finite God can be inferred, end quote. In paragraph 24 of the same chapter, he says, quote, God not equal nature, and hence nature can contain an element which resists God, end quote. The quote-unquote element that quote-unquote resists God used to be called the devil or Satan. Can one ask more of pragmatism than that it prove, in addition to the existence of God, the existence of the devil? Chapter 12, paragraph 2. Here we find the kingdom of heaven pragmatically described as seems appropriate and plausible to the average mind of the English Philistine. In this paragraph, we have, quote, the ultimate aim of the process, i.e., the development of the world, is the perfectioning of a society of harmonious individuals, end quote. Paragraph 3, quote, if so, its starting point must have been a minimum of harmony. This implies a pre-cosmic state when no interaction, and hence no world, existed. It preceded time and change and does not admit of further inquiries, end quote. Which is quite understandable for the things which happened when there was no time. No things and even no happenings are of the same nature as the dragons of Chinese fables. Just as good is what this pragmatist and teacher from the most famous English university, Pius Oxford, has to say about the end of the world. Quote, the end of the world process is the attainment of perfect harmony, or adaptation, the perfection and aim of all the activities of life, end quote. How does this ultimate state appear? This state is distinguished by its metaphysical character from the becoming of the time process, a changeless and eternal state of perfect being, end quote. A wonderful, quote-unquote, state where there is no change, no transformation, no time, and yet everything is wonderfully perfect. One is forced to admit that in comparison, the Christian and Mohammedan paradise is backward, for in these, something still happens. There are music, dancing, and other happenings. The pragmatist paradise is prolonged into eternity and filled with eternal boredom. In English, Sunday, whose bliss, as is well known, consists in absolute boredom. Quote, this includes a solution of all difficulties, evil, time, divergence of thought and feeling, etc. End quote. All people obviously think the same in this perfect state. How will they entertain themselves there? This same Mr. Schiller wrote an address for the Pan-Anglican Church Congress 1908, in which he says, quote, if all religious work are true, end quote. He recommended pragmatism to the gathered clergy of England as an especially good preservative for religion, as a better protection than idealistic philosophy, the last American patent, so to speak, for protecting religion. With this, we leave the pragmatist Sunday preachers. I will simply add that the American John Dewey is a bit more artful than these other pragmatists, but that there is no fundamental difference between him and others. In conclusion, I should like to recommend some literature. Frederick Engels' little essay on Feuerbach offers the best beginning. This little book contains a very clear and concise exposition of dialectical materialism, its developments, and its relation to bourgeois philosophy. Then, another book by Engels, entitled Der Ring. So far, this is the most comprehensive and forceful presentation of dialectical materialism and its widest application to various fields. I cannot specify any particular book by Marx. All his books are written according to the method of dialectical materialism. Further, I might mention the philosophical writings of Plenikoff. Then there is Lenin's book, Materialism and Empirico-Criticism. A proper text on historical materialism has been written by Bakurin. Further, I should like to call your attention to the writings of A. Labriola, the deceased Italian Marxist, a historical materialism, as well as the writings of Franz Marin, who was the most important materialist historian. Naturally, I take for granted that you will not merely study dialectical materialism from books, but that you have already turned to practical activity. This is thoroughly consistent with the nature of dialectical materialism. Dialectical materialism is born of revolutionary activity. It strives to afford general guidance for revolutionary activity. Karl Marx once said, quote, "The task of philosophy, and by philosophy meant materialism, is not to explain the world anew, but to change it." No one who lives in a great revolutionary period can remain merely a theorist.